Hey team!
It's Klaxoon.
Hey team, it's Klaxoon.
Hello guys, welcome everyone for this new Klaxoon webinar with experts. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mehdi. I work at Klaxoon and I will be your host for the next 30 minutes. Today we are launching our new season of webinars with a very popular and anticipated topic in the world of work right now, which is social impact of organizations. We know that this topic has been more and more important in the last month and years. We wanted to talk about it on like a public sector standpoint, but also a private sector standpoint. It's really important for customers today that organizations talk and do stuff for their social impact. So we know that reaching those objectives requires organizations to align their teams and operations. We're going to talk about this topic with an expert of the subject. I'm not by myself, obviously. We needed a real expert, and we are super happy to have with us today Karuna Kumar. Welcome, and how are you doing today, Karuna?
Thank you, Mehdi. I'm happy that you have chosen to talk about this much needed subject, and I'm glad to be here. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being with us. We will come back to you, and we're going to introduce you, of course, to the audience in a few seconds. Just before starting, a quick message for our viewers today. This webinar will take about 30 minutes, as I said, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. So feel free to share whatever question, reaction you would have during the session, to comment, ask questions, or just send some love to Karuna and me. We love that. And we will, of course, answer everything in a few minutes at the end of this session. So first, Karuna, before getting started, we want to introduce you, of course. You are having an amazing professional journey, so we're curious to know more about it. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, your journey, and what you do today?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Mehdi. So let me start by saying that one of the sort of underpinnings of my career has been this yearning for constant growth, for wanting to sort of learn about new dimensions of different aspects of work, and also looking at it from different perspectives. And I think what is most important here, specifically for the subject that we're going to talk about, is that you need to be able to see the subject through the eyes of very different stakeholders, because for each stakeholder, the point of sort of social impact varies, and justifiably so. So given that as something which has guided my career so far, I started my career actually as a journalist, and I sort of reported on the economy and the finance space. So I sort of focused on financial journalism, and I made my way from financial journalism to actually the private sector, where I was looking at specifically social impact and social purpose. And that led me to actually the international development sector, which of course has the mainstay as social, economic, and political development. So I've sort of moved from a journalist to the private sector, and most recently with the international development sector, where I've worked with the United Nations, with UNDP and UNICEF in particular. And I would say that underlying all of my sort of professional ventures that I've taken so far has been social impact. That is something which drives me. That is something I'm deeply ambitious about. I started about writing about social impact, and then moving towards actually getting sort of corporate brands engaged in social impact, and then eventually went it up to actually doing work in the social development sector and working with specifically youth and women. And I currently sort of started a new network, which is a media network that actually fills a gap in sort of knowledge space, which is that there is not enough that is being written at the intersection of policy and social impact. And there is not enough research and analysis that is being undertaken. There is not enough sort of information and knowledge about, firstly, how do we sort of look at social impact from different stakeholders? How do you measure social impact? What is the point of even engaging in socially relevant activities if there is no sort of measurement in place? And it looks very different when you sit within the private sector. It looks very different when you look at the public sector, and it looks very different when you're actually in an international development space. So I'd be happy to talk more, but I should sort of just end to say that social purpose and social impact has sort of been the driving force of most of the work that I've undertaken.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you, Karuna, for breaking that journey with us. I'm also, always curious about what leads people to, their area of expertise and what, excites them. So, yeah, for you, Karuna, what excites you the most in, in this field, in this area?
I think I would probably sound a bit lofty here, but I always felt, and this is since, I've sort of grown up and brought up in India, and then I've sort of ventured out to many different countries. I've sort of had the exposure of East and the West, and have sort of been able to sort of see the differences of, in inequality, social, economic, political inequality. And so this has been very much a part of my consciousness of actually, trying to see and thread the gap between sort of social and economic inequality that I saw whilst I was growing up. But I think what is most important is that there is a huge trust deficit which exists between the state and society. And I have sort of watched this trust deficit grow over time. And so it became really important for me, first as a journalist, and then eventually as somebody who wanted to work in the social impact sector and social development sector, to try and see why that trust deficit has continued to grow. And I think the world doesn't work in black and white. The world doesn't work in pro-capitalism and anti-capitalism state, but it's easier to see it that way. It's easier to sort of, call out, that this is white and this is black. And the same goes for the government, same goes for the public sector as well. I think it just becomes sort of a blanket perspective that the public sector is all black. It's sort of all corrupt. It's all, full of red tapeism, or the private sector is just driven by profits. And so there's no hope. So I think my sort of what excites me most is that it keeps me very hopeful of the future. It also brings great perspective, because when you actually look at the amount of inequality that exists around the world, everything else sort of falls very trivial. So I think it's both one, the fact that there has to be a more hopeful future, and it cannot just be blaming either the public sector or the private sector or society. So this sort of gap between society and state needs to be bridged. And secondly, that I think we all need to be engaged in work that brings us perspective, because I think that is what keeps you engaged and keeps you fulfilled in life. So I would say that is what probably just does excite me and makes me want to wake up and go to work every single day.
Perfect, perfect. That's so inspiring, and thank you for sharing that with us again today. Okay, it's now time. Now we know what you've been doing in your journey to get into the topics. First, we wanted to have like a broad view of the status of social impact in organizations today. So given your experience of working both in the international public and private sector, could you help us understand how organizations are contributing to social impact right now?
Sure. So I'll start with sort of just explaining the stakeholders and the distinct role each one of them play in society, because it's very important that we probably see them in the light that they're meant to be seen. So firstly, speaking of the public sector, of course, the public sector is the mainstay of any public sector, whether it's the state government or the central government, is to be in the business of provision of public goods and be in public service. And so there is, of course, the mainstay of any government or any public sector organization has to be social good. But there are limitations to it. There are limitations of budget. There are limitations of operational efficiency. There are limitations of cost effectiveness. There are limitations of talent. And so it works within these limitations. And so it is important to understand that the public sector is dealing with its own limited capacity to deliver public goods. And this differs from country to country. It differs from state to state. So drawing sort of a blanket vision of what public goods should be and to what level they should be delivered and what the government owes its people, it differs and it is contextualized to every sort of local reality. Coming to the private sector. Now, again, I think there is a perspective about the private sector that this is just sort of an, for-profit dark world out there that's just sort of, has no conscience and just sort of cheating people, which is not true, because the private sector creates the highest number of employment. Without the private sector, the employment rate of any country would be way below any basic level that could sort of guarantee a GDP that is acceptable. So the private sector is largely responsible to a great extent for employment. So it cannot be, we cannot take it away from the private sector that it is sort of, in this sort of dark world. And I think it's important to understand that of course, capitalism by its very nature, and when I say capitalism, let's sort of, probably reduce the word to the private sector and the business of the private sector in engaging employees to produce goods and services to serve consumers. Let's just put it as simple as that. But when you're talking about the process, yes, there is something that needs to change fundamentally in the principles by which organizations work, because even for-profit organizations cannot just look only at profit as the bottom line, because as I will explain later, that organizations don't exist in isolation. They exist with the money given by investors or shareholders, and they exist because consumers are willing to buy their products. So there are two entities, and let's not forget the employees. So there are investor shareholder interests that need to be taken into consideration, employee interests that need to be taken, and consumer interests. So it also does not function in isolation, and there's definitely room for improving it. But needless, to say that it is not sort of this black box of, the black sheep, if I may say. And then we come to the international development sector, which has changed drastically in recent times, in the sense that there were traditional financing mechanisms that were previously funding the work of international organizations. So the funding mechanism is now changing. And that means that they are sort of not just coming from traditional governments and sort of public sector sources, the money is also coming from the private sector. And more so, it is very important for the entire ecosystem to work together to achieve the sustainable development goals. The UN is sort of a body that sits to actually engage all of these stakeholders and to address very, very complex issues like employment, social inequality, gender inequality, and try and engage every country, every member state to contribute to that. And every member state needs to depend on its private sector as much as it needs to depend on the public sector. So this is just to put it out that it's very easy for us to sort of put each of these organizations or stakeholders in these labels. And then depending on from where you're standing, you will sort of paint them black and white. And I think that has been the most beautiful part of sort of my career so far, is that I've been able to sit in each of these organizations and see through the perspective of their eyes. And today I can sort of say with great conviction that everybody is trying. Some are trying more, some are trying, probably could try way more than they are, but there is work that's happening. So going into a little bit of specificities in terms of what should social impact really mean, and how sort of our organizations at this point in time. So just sort of historically, social impact within the private sector is quite a sort of recent realization. It's probably, I would say, perhaps 2020 is when it actually sort of occurred to organizations, and that happened because investors also became very socially conscious, and consumers also became very socially conscious. And given the fact that a social consciousness was sort of imminent in sort of the expectations of both the investors and the consumers and employees as well, I think that this is a very people-driven sort of agenda that has become the mainstay. But you said something in your introduction which really struck me. This is the word popular. And the problem with anything becoming popular and becoming a fad is that it becomes sort of a bucket list, sort of a checklist, that organizations want to do. So of course, there's an issue of greenwashing, and there's an sort of entire sort of question about whether organizations are actually delivering, any sort of social good. And so we'll probably get into the details of this, of how to sort of, engage each of these stakeholders. But I would say that at this point in time, there is tremendous amount of partnerships that are taking space between the public and the private sector. I think there is a realization by the public sector of its limitations and the private sector of its ability, of its scale, of its market penetration. And of course, the corporate social responsibility notwithstanding, because that is sort of a mandated thing, they're bound to do it. There is also a greater amount of consciousness of wanting to do social good, because that is the expectation of the investors, of the shareholders, and also of the consumers. And there is sufficient research that's gone into sort of understanding what happens to organizations when there is financial distress, or there is a sort of financial breakdown. And it has been proven that companies that do have a stronger positive perception in the eyes of the consumer and in the eyes of the investors are able to stand through sort of financial volatility as compared to other sort of organizations. So there is financial proof of greater stability if you're able to organize your operations and strategy, which is very important, because a lot of organizations are sort of financing, but they don't care about where the money is being spent, how is it being spent, and what is the impact of that money. So till the time organizations don't imbibe it in their strategy and it is not an operational mandate, then you're again just doing a checklist thing. So if I have to sort of just generalize this, because I know we have a lot of questions to get through, but if I was to just generalize it, I would say that from the public sector, what is positive is an identification that the private sector needs to be a partner. And I'm not talking just of the nexus that exists between politics and business, and where you need the business to sort of fund your political ventures, but in the provision of public goods, because the state knows that it is limited by budget, by funding, and it is limited by talent. It is limited by sort of ability to be able to sort of actually provide public goods. And this could be from anywhere, from infrastructure to health services. And so that realization is good, because then the government deregulates a lot of private sector organizations. They also deregulate areas which are full of red tapeism and perhaps leak of sort of corruption. So that deregulation is only possible when the public sector realizes its limitations and knows that it needs an honest hand from the private sector. The private sector, I would say, again, something which strikes me now is that there are many examples already in place where organizations are including sort of, delivering public goods in their strategy, in their operations, through their supply chain, which means that it is not just something which is checklist, but it is far, far behind. I'm talking of only perhaps a few of the many millions in the private sector that need to be able to engage this in sort of a strategic aspect. International organizations, I think the most positive thing is that they are actually bridging this gap between the public and the private sector. And they themselves, through practice, actually showing that these strategic partnerships between the public and private sector work, they deliver. And they also give the society a chance to participate in the state, because we know that the private sector jobs outnumber public sector jobs. So we know that there are more people that are willing to sort of contribute to social good, and so by engaging them in the strategic partnerships, they have a way and a means to actually deliver. So it's a beautiful I think time which I think the future of work is very positive, and it is social. And there is a great hope that all of these stakeholders are now deciding to sort of, go hand in hand and deliver sort of social good. So I think it's positive.
Future is bright. Future is bright. Thank you for sharing all that. And now we have like a really perfect view of every stakeholders here and what their status is, and that actually leads us to our second topic. I mean, you've been working in the private sector, and you've been talking about it. There is like a need to engage everyone in that goal objective. So speaking of your own experience there, how can organizations engage internal stakeholders, so teams, employees, and external stakeholders such as consumers, shareholders, partners, for instance, in contributing towards social purpose and social impact goals? What would be the ways to engage them in the process, basically?
So I'm so glad, Mehdi, for you to have asked this question, because it's so easy to overlook this aspect. It is so easy to look at social impact as the top-down process, where the organization comes in, they have a very ambitious mission, they release the mission statement, they get employees, they take them through the whole induction process and say, well, this is the mission, now you have to live by it, and this is what we believe. Um, and I also feel that sometimes it's easy to think that engaging employees is perhaps just an issue in the private sector, like the public sector, the development sector. Well, as it is in the field of delivering public service, so they're already sort of that is the incentive, but that is not true, because people take up areas of work for many reasons. It may not be the incentive may not be social good, or the incentive may not be that I want to do something which is social impact, and that's fair enough, because we do need people who are good in doing many other aspects of the work that they do. And so this is not sort of to take a moral high ground and say, well, everybody needs to be delivering social impact. No, everybody's doing their job well, and as a result of that, social impact can be delivered to people. So I would probably one, start with saying that irrespective of the industry, public, private, international development, NGOs, civil society groups, any organization needs to look at how employees are truly, engaged, incentivized, and so one that no sort of employee engagement process should be seen through the lens of sector, because human beings cannot be labeled just by the organization they work for or the job they do. There could be people who might be sort of, working in, marketing roles and probably minting a lot of money, but in their personal life, they could be sort of, building schools for underprivileged children and sort of directing the money that they earn to social good. So this idea that anybody who's in the corporate world is perhaps sort of this, money minting machine and is sort of just there to earn the money, and that's not true. And at the same time, of course, we know enough and more about the fact that there could be this veneer of social good when somebody's in the public sector, and it's not true. We know enough of corruption scandals, we know of enough of red tapeism to know that sort of just because you're in the public sector doesn't mean that you're driven by public service. Just because you're in the development sector does not mean that you're just driven by social development. Yes, it could be a part of your role, but human beings are driven by a number of things. There is family security, there are children to take care of, so it's important to understand that employees need to be looked at human beings, irrespective of the work that they do and the organizations they come from. Secondly, there is already enough and more growing social consciousness among everyone. I would say that generally speaking, this is something that I think, given climate change realities, and the realities are being faced irrespective of whether you sit in the West or the East or any part of the world, it is affecting everybody. Issues of sort of inequality exist even in the most developed countries. There is tremendous amount of social inequality, economic inequality exists. So that is also something which is sort of universally felt. And I think that the impact of not doing is being felt by everybody. The cost of living is rising, the cost of educating your children is rising, the cost of home ownership is rising. So we know at a fundamental level that something needs to be done about engaging yourself in for society to sort of start engaging in public goods and in the state. And so one of the most important things that organizations need to sort of see is that this has to be bottom up, is that you not only need to listen to your investors because they're making, giving you the money, you need to listen to your employees. There has to be a listening exercise that has to, be undertaken by, irrespective of which sector you belong to. But a listening exercise is the most critical aspect to undertake, to understand what are the employees expecting from their organization. What kind of organization do they really want to belong? When they go back home, do they feel proud to say, this is the organization I belong to? Because not only does it give employment to so many of us and serve so many consumers, it's also trying to do what it should do for the community. So I think this is something which is most important, is the listening exercise. And the fact that it has to be, after your listening exercise, that is when you actually say, okay, this is the larger purpose, this is what employees are expecting, and this is what our consumers are expecting, and sort of take a stronghold of, this is what the expectations of the people who make this organization work. And like I said even earlier, an organization works not just with employees, not just with consumers, not just with stakeholders, but sort of a combination, a marriage of all of these. So this is something which is completely missing. Employee listening and trying to sort of, actually make this a bottom-up approach rather than sort of a top-down approach. So that is, I think, one of the key aspects to how one should sort of engage employees.
Great. Thank you, Karuna, for those insights. That's actually funny because to engage like employees requires like a whole like shift in mentality on those topics. And also, if I can advocate a bit for Klaxoon here, tools to do so, because it's not easy to get everyone to be able to participate into those topics and raise and give their voice to the whole like collective intelligence process. So yeah, it's a shift, and you need tools to achieve it. So perfect. That's a great way to also talk about the Klaxoon a little bit. Third question. We're already like a bit in time. We might take 5 minutes more than the 30 minutes. Sorry guys about that, but we want to have that Q&A session. Really quickly, the last topic we wanted to talk about with you is about future of work. As a topic, as we said, you've been working for both public and private sector. So what, in your view, is the future of work for the public and the private sector? Are there like differences? If we can just like talk a bit about it.
Sure. And I'll try to keep it more sort of brief so that we don't sort of fatigue the audiences. So future of work, it's just a very simplistic way, I would say this, the future of work is social, because we know now that not only is sort of social consciousness sort of a checklist and ESG is sort of this checklist that you fulfill, you develop certain indicators, and you sort of say, well, we've fulfilled these goals. Future of work is social because it is very, very critical that any organization, public sector, private sector, is seen as actually listening to the public and delivering goods in a manner that is actually accessible to society. Because just to give you an example, and I think the COVID or the pandemic is a great example. So the pandemic, essentially compelled most of the provision of public goods to go digital. But in many countries, and if I was to sort of speak to developing countries specifically, the access to the internet network, the penetration of internet, in the country, rural areas specifically, tier 2, tier 3 cities, the affordability of digital devices, the ability, the digital literacy of people to be able to access those devices. So this is the problem where, giving social protection, or let's say cash transfers, where you're only using digital means to do so, but half of the population doesn't have access, cannot afford it, is not digitally literate. So there is no possibility to give those those provision of sort of public goods, because you are having to give it through a means that is not something accessible. This is just an example to state that the future of work has to be embedded in social good, because when a calamity strikes and when such emergencies strike, you realize how broken the system is, and you realize that this future of work, companies that are setting up the internet are not really thinking about how to penetrate the most sort of remote areas of the country. They are sort of looking at where's the biggest market, where are the biggest consumers, which consumer is going to pay the biggest cost, biggest price for this. So it is really important to understand that it is very critical to look at future of work as being socially responsible. Secondly, I would say is that the future of work being socially responsible depends highly on organizations adopting this culture of socially responsible behavior in their theory of change. So, theory of change, very simply put, is that mechanism through which an organization is able to see itself meet its goals. And if the goal is to be a socially responsible organization, then those mechanisms need to be right to to enable it. That is how I think the point I made earlier about the social corporate responsibility, social responsibility sort of being a part of strategy and operations is when your theory of change is inclusive of that sort of social good. So my sort of view is that going forward, the private sector specifically is going to be involved to a greater extent in social impact. There is a complete lack, I would say, understanding of measurement of social impact in a lot of public sector or sort of private sector organizations. And that is because it is not an area that is easily understood. Most often in organizations, there's a sustainability department or there's a corporate social responsibility department. And these are isolated operations that happen that, well, you are responsible for making sure that our organization does deliver some social good, and we are able to show it in our sort of quarterly earnings, we're able to show it in our quarterly reports. And so we should be able to show that we are socially conscious. But it should not be the case, because this is a value system, and a value system cannot be sort of isolated to one department. So it's very important to be able to actually integrate it in the culture and to actually look at a theory of change for the organization that listens to consumers as much as employees, as much as investors, to understand how they would make sure that this is a sustainable ecosystem.
Perfect. Thank you for those insights again on future of work and social impact. I think we have now like a great and better view of all those topics and how they work together. Finally, future of work and social impact are definitely related in public and private sectors. So perfect. Thank you so much. It's already time for the Q&A session. So I'm just going to browse the different questions we have. We have a first one from Peter. Thank you, Peter, for your question. So I quote, I saw a TED Talk, The Dirty Secret of Capitalism and a New Way Forward, by Nick Hanauer. His ideas are very close to hers, and he is optimistic that the private sector and private billionaires will change. And he's asking if you share that thought with Nick Hanauer.
Thank you, Peter. I think it's a very important question, because I think hope is what we are all sort of, our life depends on hope. But in a more sort of serious context, I think, like I said, there is an immediate need for organizations to align themselves with social impact, because organizations don't run in isolation. Without investor confidence, without shareholder confidence, without consumer interest, without employee engagement, an organization is nothing. So given the fact that consumers are getting environmentally conscious, and let me also say that the demography of the consumers also matters. There's a huge youth bulge in most of the sort of global south, and most of the private sector organizations largely are dependent on this youth bulge to be the mainstay of their consumers. There is debate about what age group constitutes youth, and so I won't go into those semantics and those details because it differs from sort of country to country. But I would say, given that we have a huge youth bulge, there is a huge majority of consumers who are looking up to organizations to not only take up innovation and take up new ways of working and delivering sort of consumer goods, but also that those goods are sustainably produced. They have a responsible supply chain, that the goods that they are paying the money for are not sort of exploiting labor. So I feel that the consumers are becoming far more socially sort of conscious than perhaps in decades or years before. Given that employees are also part of society. Just because they're employees, that doesn't mean that they sort of keep their soul outside the company. And I mean, it's not a black and white world. Employees are also sort of working to, keep their houses running. And that does not, just because they're working in the private sector, does not make them people who sort of do not, focus on socially conscious roles. And so I know that employees, and a lot of listening exercise that have already been taking place, within sort of organizations, large number of them are sort of echoing the fact that employees themselves want if not, it need not be the mainstay of their jobs, but they want a part of their jobs to sort of be socially, engaged or socially responsible. And of course, sort of investors depend on this whole ecosystem of how businesses are delivering to consumers and how cost efficiency is working. So we know that the entire ecosystem is becoming socially conscious. So this gives me hope, because it is not sort of idealism as much as it is the ecosystem in itself changing. And so I think we need to give a lot of credit to ourselves, for actually becoming socially conscious, because any movement, any social change movement always happens bottom up if it is sustainable, has to be sustainable and scalable. So that is why I am hopeful. So I'm hoping that, in 10 years when we have the session again, we have many positive stories to tell about this.
I'm sure we will. We can plan the meeting right now to talk about it. But I see what you mean, and of course we all share like that hope. Obviously, perfect. Thank you so much, Peter, for your question. We're running out of time, so we will just take one more question. We have one coming from William. Which regions are the most advanced in the future of work, and he's asking for what reasons could we have differences in advancements on that.
Okay, thank you, William, for the question. I would say that one, the interpretation of future of work is very different. The private sector looks at future of work through a different lens. The public and the international development sector look at future of work differently. But if we are saying that the future of work is social, if it is about the future of work being socially responsible, I would say that most of the work that is being done is, of course, in countries where the inequality is extremely high. And I think specifically, we've seen in the aftermath of the pandemic that this inequality has just exacerbated. And given that, I think a lot more work is being done in countries and in regions where the inequality has become a deterrent to the country's GDP, if we're speaking economically, country's sort of social construct, the divide between society and state, the inability of sort of political institutions or public institutions to actually carry on the state, a complete breakdown of the provision of public goods. And so most of these places where the future of work being socially responsible is happening at a much faster pace are countries that are themselves embedded in this reality. Because even like I said, an organization is not sort of this insular, concrete place. It may seem so from the outside, but inside it's sort of very much a part of the state. And so we know that, given the fact that the lives of employees inside and outside the organization is not two distinct sort of worlds. The consumers who are purchasing the products being sold by the private sector are also not sort of living in some sort of a vacuum. So when everybody is equally consumed by the realities of a broken state and of broken public goods, of high inequality, socially, equally, politically, it is absolutely, critical for sort of, the sort of human, existence to sort of sustain itself, to make the future of work social. So I would probably say that it's mostly in countries that are experiencing extremely high social and economic inequality.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer. I hope William has more clues now. Actually, as I was saying, we're running out of time. We could stay here and chat for hours, of course, but we have to wrap it up in a few seconds. Before leaving, Karuna, can you maybe tell us what's coming soon for you? If you have any announcement to do, news you would like to share, where we can follow you and what you do.
Yes, definitely. I think, as I sort of briefly mentioned, there is a huge knowledge gap, which is that not many people in the society understand the state, and not many people in the state truly understand society. And so in this gap of bridging the society and state is where I founded the FEM network, which is to try and explain where sort of public policy lacks, where sort of social impact is lacking. How is the public and the private sector sort of coming together to do social good? There are questions about gender inequality. There are questions about climate change. There are questions about, sort of a complete, repositioning of how the state should interact with society. And so in this sort of hope that we are able to reduce the trust deficit between society and state, and at least improve the information flow, so that with that information comes a greater understanding of the complexities that are underpinning social, economic, and political development. It is also the hope that, given greater clarity about areas that are usually a black box, how does the public sector function? How does actually the private sector engage with the public sector? Why is poverty so, stubbornly a part of our living of day-to-day society? I don't think these complex issues are well understood. And my hope is that we should be able to engage young people, given the youth bulge in our countries, in these sort of narratives, so that they become equally sort of politically, socially, economically active. And so it is my hope that we can sort of, try and mainstream politics and policy conversations, rather than just focusing on sort of good and bad, which I would say, unfortunately, most of the information that we consume is in this sort of black and white paradigm. And it is my hope that with this trust deficit will reduce, younger people will be far more engaged, and that greater information will help people understand the other side. So I'm hoping that this is a platform for consensus building. This is a platform that actually allows to sort of reduce that trust deficit, and can actually inspire, influence, and create social change. So that is where I'm at. And I would say that please look out on this space for some excellent research and analysis, to understand the sector better, to share it with sort of, young people, so that we can all be sort of equally engaged in, actually making a true state.
Perfect. Yeah, I hope everyone is going to join and follow you and engage in that in that topic. So that's perfect. I will also do so myself, of course. Also, I mean, I'm going to do the same for Klaxoon and invite you guys to make sure you follow us on our socials. We have webinars to come in the next weeks and months, just like we had today with Karuna, and make sure you tuned on those. Thank you so much again, Karuna, for our session today. That was amazing to have you, and thank you for everything you've been sharing. That was a real pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you, Mehdi. Thank you to the Klaxoon team for choosing such an important topic and for actually sort of giving it the time and space that this needs. I'm very grateful. And thank you to the audience who's been patient enough to stay on with us for this long and hear this out. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw it back at us, to Mehdi, and he can direct it to me, or you can reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to sort of take this discussion forward. And thank you, everybody. And if it's night at your end, good night. If it's morning, then I wish you a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, guys. See you very soon. And bye-bye.